It was fall semester when Jenny, a bright-eyed freshman, moved into her college dorm. She shared her room with a girl named Tara, a quiet and mysterious senior who spent most of her time away. Jenny didn't mind, happy to have more space to herself. One night, while Jenny was studying late, Tara came in and said she was heading home for the weekend. She grabbed her bag and left without saying goodbye. The following days were peaceful, with Jenny enjoying the solitude. But that Friday night, around 2 a.m., she began to hear strange noises, whispers that seemed to float through the air vents. At first, she thought it was the neighbors, but the voices sounded too close, like they were coming from inside the room. By the third night, the whispers turned into faint sobbing. It was unmistakably coming from Tara's bed. Terrified, Jenny checked the empty bed but found nothing. She texted Tara, asking if she was okay, but received no response. The next morning, Jenny went to the resident assistant to ask if Tara was still off campus. The RA's face turned pale. Tara never left, she whispered, her voice trembling. She passed away last month in a car accident. You've been assigned a single room. Jenny's blood ran cold as she realized the sobbing hadn't stopped. It was louder now. Jenny turned slowly, her back pressed against the door. The shape in Tara's bed was gone, but the whispers remained, growing louder, more desperate. "Help me. Please," the voice echoed, this time more insistent. The air felt thick, pressing in on her, as if the room itself was alive with an unseen presence. Her heart raced as she looked around, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. Tara's side of the room was eerily still, but Jenny could feel something was terribly wrong. The temperature continued to plummet, and her breath began to fog the air in front of her. Then the sobbing started again, this time much closer. It wasn't coming from the bed anymore. It was behind her, right next to the door. Jenny's body went cold. She could feel it, someone standing just inches behind her. She could almost feel their breath, hear their ragged sobs. But she didn't dare turn around. The door behind her began to vibrate softly, as if something or someone was pounding against it from the other side, desperate to get in or, worse, out. A faint scratching sound echoed from within the walls, like nails dragging across the plaster, circling the room. The light flickered above her, casting wild shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Jenny couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone from her pocket, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely unlock the screen. She dialed the RA's number, her pulse pounding in her ears as she waited for an answer. The call went through, but all she heard on the other end was static. Her heart sank as the static began to morph, voices filtering through, faint whispers, overlapping, too many to understand. Suddenly, the voice of Tara cut through the static, clear and filled with fear. "Why didn't you help me, Jenny?" Jenny dropped the phone in horror, her stomach twisting into knots. Tara's voice wasn't just coming from the phone. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the air, the bed. It surrounded her. The door behind her creaked, and Jenny forced herself to turn, her back sliding down the wall until she was crouched on the floor, trembling. The door was still shut, but now there were deep scratches gouged into the wood, as though something had clawed at it from the inside. Before she could even comprehend what she was seeing, the bed started to creak again. Slowly, the sheets lifted, as if something invisible was sliding under them. Jenny stared in disbelief as the indent of a body began to form beneath the blankets. Legs, torso, arms, and then a head. It was Tara, or what was left of her. Jenny felt her breath catch in her throat as the figure beneath the sheets slowly turned its head toward her. The whispering grew louder, filling the room, until it became a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. "Help me, Jenny." Tara's voice cut through the others, sharp and accusing. "You were supposed to help me." The shape in the bed began to move, sitting up slowly, the sheets sliding off to reveal a pale, gaunt figure, its face hidden in shadow. Tara's eyes, hollow and sunken, locked onto Jenny's. But something about them wasn't right. They were too dark, too empty, like the eyes of someone who had been lost for a long, long time. Jenny couldn't breathe. She felt paralyzed, trapped in the room with the thing that had once been her roommate. Suddenly, Tara's hand reached out toward her, fingers long and thin, bones visible beneath her pale skin. The air grew heavier, and Jenny felt an overwhelming force pulling her toward the bed, toward the outstretched hand. "You should have helped me." Tara's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. "Why didn't you help me?" The pull grew stronger, and Jenny struggled to resist, her body sliding across the floor as the cold hand inched closer. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes, and she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. Just as the hand was about to touch her, the door behind her burst open, slamming into the wall with a deafening crash. The spell was broken. The whispers stopped. The sobbing vanished. Jenny scrambled to her feet, gasping for air. She turned to the door, her heart racing, expecting to see the RA or someone who had come to save her. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light. She turned back to the room, but the bed was empty again. The sheets were neatly folded, the room eerily quiet. It was as if nothing had happened at all. But Jenny knew better. Tara was still there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting. And now Jenny realized with horror that she might never truly be alone again. Jenny stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. The room was too quiet now, the kind of silence that pressed on your ears, that screamed something was terribly wrong. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. But she had to. She had to end this. Trembling, she stepped back into the room. "Tara?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still, the shadows in the corners of the room motionless. But then, the sobbing returned, faint and distant. It echoed from everywhere at once, like it was coming from deep within the walls, the very foundation of the dorm itself. Suddenly, the room grew icy again, and Jenny felt a cold wind brush past her, blowing her hair across her face. Tara's bed creaked once more, the same slow, deliberate sound that had haunted her for nights. Jenny knew she couldn't keep running. If she didn't do something, this would never end. Her eyes darted around the room, and then it hit her. Tara's things, what little she had left behind, were still in the room. A dusty backpack under the bed, an old journal half hidden in the desk drawer. Maybe Tara hadn't been able to move on because part of her was still trapped here, lingering, waiting for something unfinished. Jenny reached under the bed and pulled out the backpack, coughing as a cloud of dust rose up. She fumbled with the zipper, her fingers numb from the cold. Inside, there were a few notebooks, a broken phone, and, tucked deep in a side pocket, a small, folded piece of paper. With shaking hands, Jenny unfolded it. It was a letter hastily written, the ink smudged in places as if Tara had been crying when she wrote it. "Mom, Dad, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm not okay. I've been struggling for so long, and I don't think I can keep going. I'm sorry. I love you both, more than words can say, but I can't handle the weight anymore. Please don't hate me. Tara." Jenny's stomach turned. This was it. Tara had been planning to leave that weekend, but not for a trip home. She had intended to leave forever, and she never got the chance. The accident had taken her before she could make that final decision. Tears filled Jenny's eyes as the weight of Tara's pain hit her. She wasn't just a ghost haunting this room. She had been trapped in the same despair that had consumed her before she died. She hadn't moved on because she didn't know how. Tara's spirit was searching for peace, something to release her from the torment that had bound her to this place. "I'm so sorry," Jenny whispered, her voice breaking. She folded the letter carefully, holding it tight against her chest. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." The room shifted again, the sobbing intensifying for a moment, then softening, as if Tara was listening. Jenny stood up and, with trembling hands, placed the letter and Tara's belongings into the backpack. She knew what she had to do. That night, under a cold, starless sky, Jenny walked to the small campus memorial where students who had passed were remembered. She laid the backpack down beneath a tree, setting it gently in the soft grass. She whispered a quiet prayer, hoping, begging, that it would be enough. As she turned to leave, The wind stirred, brushing lightly against her skin. The air, once freezing, felt warmer now, as if a weight had lifted. She paused, looking back at the memorial, and for just a fleeting moment, she saw her, Tara, standing beneath the tree, her face calm, her eyes no longer hollow. She smiled, a soft, sad smile, and then just like that, she was gone. The next day, Jenny packed up her things and requested a transfer to a new dorm. She couldn't stay in that room anymore, but as she left, she felt a strange sense of peace. Tara was no longer there. The sobbing, the whispers, the cold presence, they were all gone. But every now and then, when she passed by that old dorm building late at night, she swore she could still feel Tara's eyes on her, watching from a distance. Not with anger, but with gratitude. And for the first time in weeks, Jenny slept peacefully, knowing her roommate had finally found the rest she so desperately needed. Madison was excited to start her sophomore year in the newly renovated dormitory. The building had a history of being a hospital during World War II, but that only added to the charm. On her first night, she noticed something odd about the mirror in her room. It wasn't like any normal mirror. It gave off a faint, almost imperceptible hum when the room was silent. One night, after a long study session, Madison stared at her reflection, noticing something was off. The reflection didn't match her movements. When she raised her hand to her face, her reflection smiled, a wide, sinister grin that stretched far beyond what should have been humanly possible. Shaking, she stepped away, but the reflection remained smiling at her. She closed her eyes, trying to shake off the fear, and when she opened them again, everything seemed normal. Too shaken to sleep, she covered the mirror with a sheet. The next morning, she felt uneasy but chalked it up to exhaustion. That night, however, Madison was woken up by the sound of the sheet falling to the floor. Groggily, she looked toward the mirror, only to see her reflection standing there, staring back at her. Except this time, it wasn't smiling. It was just standing, watching her. Suddenly, the reflection moved, out of sync with Madison's real movements. It stepped forward and placed its hand against the glass, as if trying to break through. She scrambled out of bed, throwing the sheet over the mirror again. But the sound of nails scratching the glass kept her awake for the rest of the night. The reflection was no longer hers, and now it wanted out. During finals week, Tyler was staying late in the university library, cramming for an important exam. The library was deserted, with most students choosing to study in groups elsewhere. Around midnight, Tyler decided to take a break and walked outside to get some air. As he was heading back inside, he heard a soft knock on one of the nearby windows. Startled, he turned to see a pale figure standing just outside the window. It was a girl, her eyes hollow, and she wore what looked like an old-fashioned nightgown, tattered and stained. She knocked again, her lips forming words he couldn't hear. Tyler froze. There was something unnatural about the way she stood, perfectly still except for her arm, which moved with each knock. He shook his head and hurried inside, his heart racing. Later, when he mentioned it to the librarian, she grew pale. "That girl," she said, her voice shaking, "was a student here a long time ago. She died during finals week, found in her dorm room after she failed to show up for her exams." Tyler didn't return to the library at night after that, but the knocks continued. Every night at midnight, whether he was in his dorm or out in the courtyard, he heard the same rhythmic knock. He knew it was her, still waiting to be let in. Professor Caldwell was notorious for holding his lectures in the oldest building on campus, a place that students swore was haunted. The lecture hall was cold and dimly lit, with creaking wooden floors and faded, moth-eaten curtains hanging over broken windows. On the last day of class, Professor Caldwell assigned a final project and left the students to work in groups. Sarah and her friends decided to stay late in the lecture hall, figuring it would be quiet. As the night grew darker, strange things began to happen. First, Sarah noticed the temperature drop, far colder than it should have been for a late spring night. Then, the lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Her friends laughed it off, but Sarah felt a presence, something unseen watching them from the corners of the room. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the back of the hall slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. Panic set in as the lights flickered again, and they heard footsteps echoing across the room. But when they looked, no one was there. One by one, Sarah's friends began to see things. Shadowy figures standing at the edges of the room, disappearing the moment they turned their heads. Whispers filled the air, too soft to make out, but loud enough to send chills down their spines. When they tried to leave, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it closed from the outside. They pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. Just as Sarah was about to collapse in fear, the door creaked open on its own, revealing an empty hallway. They fled the building, never looking back. But every now and then, when Sarah passes by that lecture hall, she hears the whispers again, calling her back inside.